how do you do what you do? Like, let me back up for a sec. You weigh 165-ish pounds and you can do a split squat or reverse lunge with 405.
Yeah.
And that's like maybe 180 kilograms. And you can also run 90 miles. Like not every single day.
Right.
But you're covering both of the bases here. Like I can't do either of those things anywhere. Like I can't probably split squat half of that amount. And I can't run, a tenth of that amount without bursting into flames. And you're not just able to do these things, you can do these things exceptionally well to the point of like breaking world records and being a very, very high achieving hybrid athlete. And, you know, before we even get to the programming or the training side of things, which we will get to because I really want to unpack all those nerdy details, but there must be a certain level of just mental, what the fuck is going on in your head when you're on mile 89 or when you're at, 315 on split squat saying, you know what, I could put another plate on.
Yeah.
Like, how do you get to that point?
I think a lot of it is just the love of training more than having a specific objective, because when you think of kind of hybrid training, you're not going to be the best at anything. So it's not like I'm trying to set world records in the back squat or something like that. So there's no sort of, super specific performance goal. It's just trying to be a little bit better at everything I can on a consistent basis. And I've been doing it a really long time. So when I started doing hybrid training like 15 years ago, I never dreamed that I would be lunging 405 and running ultras, simultaneously. It didn't even occur to me that you could be at that level at the same time. But I started, I was running marathons and doing lunges with 200 pounds. And then, the next year was a little bit more, and the next year was a little bit more, just kind of pursuing it for the love of hard work, the love of training. I'm just trying to get better. And eventually it's like, holy shit, I didn't know that you could get to this level at both of these things at the same time. It's just taken a really long time. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand or don't appreciate about hybrid training. Is even if you're just focused on one sport, it takes a long time to get good at something. When you're doing both, it takes even longer.
Totally.
And hybrid training is kind of the new thing. People are kind of jazzed up about it right now. But it's not something you're going to do for 1 year or 2 years and be good at. You might go through phases where cardio kills your gains or you're not making any progress at this or that, but you kind of got to ride the waves and just see it through. And if you give it enough time, you'll be amazed what you can accomplish.
Yeah, a couple of things. I feel like you say like, oh, I'm not the best. I feel like you are like the best. When you have a world record in the Murph challenge, is it? Mm-hmm. So could you just tell people what that is actually? It's a CrossFit challenge.
Yeah, so Murph is a kind of world famous CrossFit workout that it's a Memorial Day tradition. So Memorial Day in the US, the end of May. People all around the world kind of get together and do Murph, which it's a 1 mile run followed by 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, and then another mile run, all while wearing a 20-pound weight vest. And then there's two kind of ways to do it. You can either partition the reps. So a lot of people will do like 5 pull-ups, 10 push-ups, 15 squats, and then go through like 20 rounds of that. Or you can do unpartitioned, which means you have to do all 100 pull-ups before moving on to all 200 push-ups and then all 300 squats. So the kind of unofficial world record that I have is for the weight vested and unpartitioned format. So going straight from one exercise to the next. And that took me 32 minutes and 41 seconds. And that's a record I never thought I would break. It's not something I trained specifically for. It's just kind of the accumulation of all the aerobic fitness from 15 years of ultra running and the strength from 15 years of strength training. I just decided, I'm going to give it a go for fun just at my gym. I knew what the record was because the previous record holder, Hunter McIntyre, phenomenal athlete, by the way. I've raced against him. I've competed against him many times, and I've come close, but I've never beaten him at anything. So
right.
I knew his time. I kind of had that as a target in my head, and like, let's see how close I can get. And just at my gym for fun, I beat his record and was like, well, shoot, I got to make this official. So I called up some guys, organized an official record attempt, and took it down officially a few weeks later.
So you had to do it. You did it twice.
I did it twice. Yeah.
That's messed up. Yeah. So you clearly are not just dabbling in what you do as hybrid athlete. You actually are like in that upper echelon, and like to be able to have those you say you're not the best in the world at say squatting or whatever, but to have a 405 or 180 kilograms split squat, yeah, it's not a world record back squat where people are doing maybe, I don't know, 700 pounds or whatever your body weight or something stupid like that. But it is still an exceptionally rare level of strength that most strength athletes won't achieve normally, like even with hard, consistent training for several years. And the same thing with like doing a lot of your aerobic or endurance-based performances. It's not like I can consider myself a hybrid athlete because I've spent the last couple of years playing around with it, and I can, run 10 kilometers without dying, but that's about it. That's like, I don't know, it's not even 5 miles, is it? That's
6. It's 6 miles.
It's cute, isn't it? It's cute to you. Like, oh, that's a light snack. Like I did that this morning as my first interval. That's how you're feeling right now. You're like, oh, it's very cute, Eugene. And it's just, and not to just be blowing smoke up your ass, but it is something that I don't think a lot of people realize just how impressive some of this stuff is.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, like it is. And the special thing about it is you've mentioned like you don't specialize. Like it's something where you enjoy training and you just enjoy this little daily progression each time with what you do, and the end isn't something you're working towards, which is weird because like I'll look at something and be like, fuck, you do a 405 split squat. I want to work on specifically improving my split squat now to get it as high as I can, as close to 405. But that's not really your goal.
So my training is extremely varied. I'd say I have probably as much variety as I possibly could, without, struggling to progress. Sometimes I may even have a little bit too much just because I think it's fun. And I certainly wouldn't say that's the correct way to train. Like there's nothing wrong with picking some very specific objectives and working on your back squat and your deadlift and your bench press or whatever. But I really enjoy exploring a super wide range of movements. I do some weightlifting, some powerlifting, some hypertrophy training, some kind of old time strongman lifts or like silver, golden era lifts. So I do an exceptionally wide range of movements. And I think that has kind of two consequences, for better or worse. One is that I'm not really great at any of them, right? Like I do have some impressive single leg lifts, but I would say on the whole, I'm not extremely skilled at, deadlifting or bench press. People would be like, what do you deadlift? I'm like, next question. Like I don't excel at any single lift. But you can give me a lift I've never done before, say, and just from my wide range of experience, I feel like I can pick up pretty much anything and be pretty good at it right away, just because I have a much broader skill set. And I think that overall that's allowed me to train really, really hard because I haven't gotten burnt out. I haven't deadlifted so much that I never want to touch a barbell again. So I'm able to kind of keep that consistency and keep that intensity because it's kind of distributed across a couple more things. And again, not the best way to train, not the worst way to train. It's just what I've done, and I really enjoyed it. It's allowed me to stay as consistent and train as hard as I have for so long.
I mean, yeah, it sounds totally like fun and exciting. I mean, that's kind of like what, for me, growing up is like very heavily specific into bodybuilding, hypertrophy only, and everything's got to be about how do I create the biggest muscle building responses I can, but not necessarily getting a lot stronger or not necessarily getting very fit or mobile and exploring new patterns all the time. I was finding myself getting quite burned out and bored with the whole thing of like, yeah, cool, I had another 10 kilos of muscle the last 5 years or whatever, but now what? I look good, but I'm not performing better across other modalities. And I'm also just kind of bored of the training because at a more advanced level, bodybuilding specifically isn't just about doing a whole bunch of random shit. You actually start to reduce the number of exercises you do and just pick maybe 5 things that you really like for your back or your biceps and just do them for the rest of your career and don't vary it too much so you can focus on your progression, which is honestly kind of boring. And that's part of why, the last few years, I've really connected a lot with doing more hybrid work where I'll add in some calisthenics. I'll add in a lot more of the old-time strongman, some more mobility work, flexibility, running as well, and more circuit-based training just to keep things stimulating. But I do find myself, it's like you said, it's very hard to balance things out. And I am really, like you mentioned at the start of our chat, hard to balance and make progressions sort of just riding the waves where like, I lost a bit of muscle this last couple of months. Okay, I've been doing a bit too much running. I'm getting a lot weaker, even though I'm getting a lot fitter. Or I'm getting really strong, but now my runs are suffering. And I guess this is where it gets confusing because I have noticed as well that hybrid training is becoming trendy. And I'm part of that trend. Like I've jumped on that bandwagon myself. But how do we go about starting in terms of doing it intelligently to the point where we're not just doing everything in the gym and snapping everything and just regressing?
Yeah. I think, when you start hybrid training, that path forward from day one is going to look different depending on what your initial background, what type of athlete you are. So are you an endurance athlete trying to get more into strength for the first time? Are you a strength athlete trying to get into endurance for the first time? And I think the latter is a little bit more common. Most of the people that I work with, at least, and talk to, they've been lifting weights for a long time, and it's kind of a common story here all the time. They're like, I'm a little burnt out on it. I'm a little bored. I realize that cardio is important for my health. So they want to start endurance training for some of these reasons. And I find that a lot of the people that have initially gravitated towards strength training and gotten pretty good at that, they do that because they kind of have a predisposition for it. They have some natural talent on the strength training side of things. And often those people don't have much natural talent for the endurance training side of things. So it's hard. And I think they have this expectation of what their progress is going to look like. Maybe they showed up to the gym and they were deadlifting 200 kilos within their first year. Things came very naturally to them. So they expect something similar to happen when they start running, and it just doesn't.
Right.
It's really hard. The progress is really slow. They're like, what the heck? I can't do an easy run without my heart rate, going over 200. What's wrong with me? And it's like, you're just not good at running, and that's okay. It is a long process. So just accepting that and having kind of, expectations set appropriately that you're not going to be good at it right away. How long or how much of your life did you spend not doing endurance training? You can't expect to be at a high level within that first year or two, even if things came, quickly or naturally to you on the other side. When you look up like a beginner 5K program or couch to 5K, right? Like some of these programs, to an experienced runner might look at some of these programs and be like, oh yeah, that's easy. That's a great beginner's program. Even something like that might be too advanced for a new hybrid athlete, because this is someone who, they're not a 130 pound, 60 kilo runner. They're a 100 kilo strength athlete with a ton of muscle.
Yeah.
And when you start running what might seem like a small distance to a runner, that could be a pretty huge distance and a ton of impact and a ton of stress for that larger hybrid athlete that is new to running. So even what looks like a beginner program at first glance to just a runner might be a little bit too advanced for the hybrid athlete. So realizing that your starting point might be very unsexy. It might seem very simple. You might be spending a lot of time just kind of incline walking or riding a bike or something like that to develop that initial aerobic base. But the better of a base you build for yourself, and the more you can avoid some of those like initial injuries that people often get from going out a little bit too hot, the better off you're going to be in the long run, and you're not going to get as frustrated.
Yeah, that's definitely something that resonated a lot with me, because when I first started more of the hybrid kind of stuff, I spent maybe about a year, or maybe more like 6 months to a year, working heavily on improving my conditioning for overall health and just endurance, but that wouldn't be anything running related. It was very low impact. I was just living on the air bike. I was doing some body weight circuits, some medicine ball, just calisthenic-y kind of things, keeping my heart rate relatively elevated in a way that I wouldn't get from typical weights. And I think that helped quite a bit, because when I started running, you're exactly right. Like I would do maybe a 2-minute run, which doesn't sound very long. And that would destroy my legs. That would destroy my joints. Like I would just feel my ankles and my calves and my feet really inflamed. By the end of that, I'd be fine cardiovascularly though, because I feel like I spent that time doing a lot of aerobic base building through, even like, it's always been honestly a bit of a mainstay in my programming, but I heavily focused on it almost daily for about a year or 6 months before I started running. But yeah, I find it's so hard to know how to pace yourself when it comes to, let's say like running, for example, is it's very hard to know where the line is before you start like tipping over and saying, oh, this feels okay. And you go 10 seconds faster as your pace, and all of a sudden you're dying.
Yeah.
That was such just mind-boggling to me, which I guess is kind of similar to weightlifting, where you can do 100 kilos on a lift, you put 105 on, and it's not moving.
Right.
And the same thing happens with running, where you're sustaining a certain pace and you go 5 to 20 seconds, that little bit faster, and then you just die.
Yep.
You just burn out. Like what's happening there?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, when they have this experience, they get frustrated with the pacing. They often think there's like something wrong with them, or they want help. They're like, I can't figure out the pacing. I don't get it. I don't know how hard I'm supposed to be pushing for this workout versus that workout. And there's definitely some kind of guiding principles that we can use to help someone pick appropriate paces and appropriate intensities. But there's no escaping that learning curve of, you're just gonna have to figure out like how fast is too fast, and like learn that pacing over time. And I think the best way to learn is by messing up. If I try to control and kind of constrain you too much, I'm like, all right, Eugene, you can't get your heart rate above X on this run. That's fine. It may work, but I kind of want you to have that experience of go out and being like, oh shit, that was too much. Because that is a far better teaching tool than me just giving you some, somewhat arbitrary heart rate or pace target. Because I don't want you to be reliant on, me as a coach or your watch. I don't want you out there running, looking at your watch the whole time. It can be useful as, kind of training wheels or a tool, and great data analysis afterwards.
Feeling called out right now.
But I want you to learn to, like, if you were just running out there without your watch and I said, what zone are you in, or how long do you think you could keep this pace up? I would want you to be able to kind of tell me and be like, yeah, I think I could hold this for about 8 to 10K if I had to. Right. And I would hope that you're pretty accurate. But just like we see in the gym, he brings someone in the gym on day one and ask them to estimate their RIR, right? They might be way off. They might be like, oh, I only have 2 more. And you're like, nah, you got like 10, You can definitely see that with endurance training as well. But like in the gym, sometimes the only way to kind of set that baseline is just to tell someone to send it and be like, you're not doing 2 more, you're doing 10 more. You're not going to stop until I tell you to stop.
Right. True.
And over time, they're like, oh, that's what I'm capable of. And, pretty quickly people will figure out, what they're really able to achieve. But even for the advanced lifter, and for the advanced endurance athlete, every once in a while, you got to have a workout where, you really send it and reset that baseline for yourself and see what you can. See what you can do. So I think for everyone, some occasional like time trials, max effort sprints, that sort of thing, to be like, oh yeah, that's what I can do. And I think that's really helpful for developing those pacing skills.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy what you're hearing about me and my training, be sure to click the link below to see some of the programs that I have to offer.
That makes total sense. Like I never even thought about it from the gym perspective, but I know like the way that I work with all my clients and all the people that I know is like, I'll make sure I've got failure programmed in. Like, you're going to send this set, you're going to go to, you can't do anymore. I'm going to be in your ear about it, not because that's how you should train all the time, but it's a really important learning tool, and setting the baseline as an indicator for this is 100%. So now you know what 70% should feel like, or 60%. You can work backwards from there. I never thought about it from like a running perspective, because I'd jump online and be like, oh, how fast should I do my 5K? Here are some average beginner paces for a 5K. Here's some average intermediate. So I'll say I'm a beginner, so I should be doing this pace. I'll just pick a random number. I'll set it to my Garmin watch goal, and I'll just do that. And some days it's okay, some days it's bad. Depending on what number I choose, it's very hit and miss. And I just sort of focus on the numbers. If I told somebody in the gym to just focus on the number without any body awareness of what they're actually feeling, I know they'll get some result,
right?
But I know they won't get the best result possible. So that's interesting, because I think so many people are, and I know, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in the endurance world and even the health world, things like zone 2 and zone 3 and zone 4, like they're so clearly defined as targets.
Right.
So what is some of your thoughts around like heart rate zones? Like, should we be doing a lot of zone 2, and what does zone 2 look like?
Well, it's not too different than the gym, in the sense that if you just bring someone in and say, okay, your workout today is 10 reps at 70%, there's a lot of assumptions kind of baked into that of, is the 1RM set appropriately, and how well does this person perform at various percentages and things like that. 10 reps at 70% might be tough for one person and not so tough for another person. And the same thing is true for heart rate zones. A lot of people think of zone 2, which is kind of your easier, more sustainable cardio that you can do for a large percentage of your training. People will be like, oh, zone 2 is 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. Or they'll say, oh, it's 70 to 77% of your lactate threshold heart rate, or whatever metric they want to use.
Yeah, it gets complicated.
There's all sorts of kind of percentages and thresholds that you can use, but there's no one size fits all, and it's really not a super specific thing anyway. Like we kind of want to science it up and have this level of precision. People feel comfortable and they're like, oh, I know exactly what my zone 2 is. No one knows exactly what their zone 2 is. It's not something you can define exactly. It's a range, it's an idea, it's a concept more than anything. So there are some sort of inflection points or thresholds, so to speak, in terms of what's happening physiologically, but it's really a spectrum more than anything.
Right. So what is happening? What are we looking for, I guess, internally, and like what's happening within the body?
Yeah. So primarily in terms of what's happening within the body, you're just shifting energy substrates from more aerobic kind of beta oxidation, so fat burning, if you will, to aerobic glycolysis, so more carb or glycogen burning, and then bringing in some more of the anaerobic energy systems at progressively higher intensities. But we know that these energy systems don't function kind of independently. They all overlap and assist each other at all times. So it's not like there's this big shift of like, oh, you went anaerobic and your aerobic system just shut off. I always bring up the point that, even with higher intensity work, like if you're running 1 mile, it's like a 1.5K or so. If you're running that pretty short distance all out, a good runner might cover that ground in 5 minutes. So that's a pretty high intensity. That's still 95% aerobic in terms of energy system contribution. So when a lot of people are running hard, they're like, oh, I've gone anaerobic. Your aerobic system is still doing 95% of the work. So endurance training by and large is an aerobic activity, whether it's low, medium, or high intensity. Once you get into sprints and whatnot, it's a little bit different. But you are shifting kind of energy substrate use, muscle fiber type activation and whatnot. But for the most part, it's just a matter of how long can you sustain the effort and how much of that kind of quality training can you accumulate. So lower intensity training, you can do a lot of. Higher intensity training, you can't do so much of. And there are kind of distinct benefits to training at different intensities. And I think a mistake that a lot of beginners make is they're afraid of high intensity. Like, oh, I'm just kind of starting out. I'm just going to do low intensity for a while. And then 2 years later, they're slow and they're not sure why.
Okay.
Or they're like, I'm just going to do sprints. Sprints is all you need. And they ignore kind of their low intensity kind of fat burning energy system, so to speak. And then they have no endurance and they've kind of plateaued and they wonder why. So regardless of what your level is, there's benefits to be had from training at all of those intensities. You just have to do the appropriate amount of volume of all of it and dose it all correctly.
Yeah. So we have I guess people for zone 2, what they're looking for is something they can sustain for a long time. We're not necessarily saying, what's your heart rate? Is it 130? Oh my God, you're at 135 now. Can it?
Yeah. But
it should be like, can you sustain this for, what would be like a target for duration if they're doing zone 2?
What I always come back to is it depends on the context of the program. So if I'm working with you and I'm like, Eugene, how many hours per week can you commit to training? And you're like, I want to do 3 hours of cardio per week. My question for you then is, okay, what kind of intensity can you sustain? What intensity could you do for that 3 hours per week and still recover from and still feel good? Right. And the answer to that question is going to be different compared to, if I ask a pro cyclist who's training for 30 hours a week, what kind of intensity can you sustain for 30 hours of weekly training and still recover? For you, if you're training a couple hours, if you push your zone 2 a little bit too hard, big whoop. You've gone a little bit too quickly.
Yeah.
Multiply that times 3 hours of weekly training, you're probably going to be okay.
Yeah.
Take a professional endurance athlete training for 3-4 hours a day. They bump up that intensity just a little bit. The consequences could be huge in terms of how they feel their ability to train hard the next day. So your margin of error goes down. The closer you are to your limits in terms of recovery, the more training you're doing overall, that zone 2 might need to be a little bit more conservative. Something I bring up often is the zone 2 pace of a lot of elite marathon runners, for example, is very, very slow. And it's about the same pace I do my zone 2 work at, despite them being significantly faster, significantly fitter. So that kind of brings up the question of how come these two athletes, vastly different fitness levels, are doing the same pace for some of their easy runs? Like, how does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And I run right now maybe 40 miles a week compared to some of these guys that are running 100, 150 miles a week sometimes. So when they're trying to accumulate those sorts of volumes, they just have to slow down in order to still recover and put in the quality they need for their high intensity work. So zone 2 or easy training can really be a very wide range that is contextually dependent on what else are you doing? What is your training volume? How much intensity do you have? And the big question of people are always like, am I doing my zone 2 work too fast? How do I know if I'm doing my zone 2 work too fast or too slow? Is I'll tell people, like, experiment, slow down, do your zone 2 work a little bit slower for a week or two and see how you feel. If you notice that when you slow down a little bit, your recovery improves, you feel better, you should probably do that.
Yeah, totally.
If you increase the speed of your zone 2 work and you're like, oh my God, I'm so tired now, like the fatigue is just brutal, that was a mistake. So you kind of have to work with it a little bit and play with it. There's definitely some guidelines. You can use the heart rate percentages, lactate threshold percentages, the talk test, or kind of ventilatory threshold, we call it. You can use all of those things as a starting point. But what I always return to is how is your recovery? Because that is the goal of zone 2 work. The goal of zone 2 work is to allow you to train more, to do more volume of easy training, and to allow you to still push hard when you're supposed to push hard. So if you're recovering well, if you can put in the volume you need to do, if you can put in the intensity that you need, you're just fine. If your heart rate is 5 beats higher than it's supposed to be based on a percentage, but you're checking all those other boxes, who cares? You're fine. But you might find that, okay, I want to add some mileage. I want to increase my weekly training volume. You might have to back off a little bit. So when I'm training a little bit more conservatively, if I'm short on time, my zone 2 work might actually be a little bit harder because my resources aren't spread as thin. I can afford to just push it just a little bit within reason for sure. If I'm going to really push hard on my training, if I'm going to commit, if I have a race I'm training for, I'm not going to speed up in my zone 2 work. I'm going to slow down because I'm going to be training more. I'm going to be training harder on my hard days. And so I have to make room for that by backing off that zone 2 intensity.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I think already something that comes to my mind, and this is probably just second nature to you and probably what you're already doing, I guess, is instead of considering it zone 2, which automatically tells me there must be a benchmark of a zone, heart rate, whatever, you're calling it easy training. And easy training is a very wide spectrum. It's a very relative term to what else you're doing. And I mean, what you said about like an elite level marathon runner who's doing 200 miles or whatever in a week versus you doing 40 miles versus me doing, 5 miles. Cute. But there actually could be contexts where me as a complete beginner doing 5 miles, my zone 2 easy training could be the same pace as an elite level marathon runner. And that's because that elite level marathon runner could be doing just so much more work than me that they've got to reduce the volume. In my head, I would have thought that because they're so much more advanced, everything they do is just better than me. Their easy training must be my max training. Because I think, who was that? I'm not even going to try to say his name. That marathon runner who did a marathon in like an hour or something stupid.
Eliud Kipchoge?
Yes, thank you for saying the name correctly so I don't have to say it again. I'll just copy paste that into my AI voice instead.
There you go.
But like his pace is exceptionally quick. And I'd expect that because he's like the best in the world at this kind of stuff. But there could be periods of training where his easy training, the pace might match my easy training just because I'm only doing an hour a week and he's doing maybe 50 hours a week instead.
Yeah.
Like that's, because we're not shooting for the heart rate zone, we're shooting for the actual perceived intensity of what is going to let you do all the work you have to do in the week. And what you have to do in the week in terms of total hours or total mileage or total even gym training, that's going to be dependent on the actual goal.
Yes.
Where Eliud, his goal is to do like, I don't know, let's say 200 miles in a week. My goal is to do 5 miles a week, but 3 hours of gym training or 10 hours of gym training instead. So I can afford to go a little bit higher potentially, whereas he has to go a little bit lower for both of our easy trainings.
Exactly. And there's other contexts to be aware of too, in that, the pro marathoner might have, many, many more hours of endurance training that they have to worry about. you have the stress of training in the gym.
Yeah.
So there are training stresses that you have to account for. And that may require you to slow down a little bit as well. But more often I find that if you do a lot of gym training, it works really, really well to have some low impact cardio modalities in your plan. So even if you are a runner, getting off your feet a little bit can be really, really helpful and allow you to just get in more of that general aerobic training, more just aerobic hours in your week without just smashing the legs every single time. So for the advanced marathoner, they may slow down a lot on their easy training. For the hybrid athlete who does a lot of time in the gym, they might get on a bike for some of that training. So that they're able to still get some decent quality, decent speed for the miles they are doing, but they're still getting that low intensity aerobic work elsewhere for the general support.
Right. So you might look at it to, like, say, any hybrid athlete who may just be more recreational like myself and say, how many hours a week can you devote to your cardiovascular training? And they might say, 5 to 10 hours. And then next question is, okay, how much should we devote to actually running? Because we need to condition your muscles for that. But then and make sure you keep moving forward. But also we need to devote a good amount of time to low impact bike, elliptical, whatever, swimming, to still get the cardiovascular benefit, but not just beat up the joints.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, most hybrid athletes, especially larger athletes, and especially athletes that just don't have a big kind of base of impact. They didn't play sports. They weren't a soccer, football player, or whatever you guys call it in Australia. They don't have that experience of just having time on their feet and that sort of thing. They may need to work on a lot more like plyometrics and things like that to kind of prepare the body, if you will, for some of that impact. That can be a great use of their time. That may be a better use of their time. I may prefer to see someone do, a 10, 15 minute kind of plyometric routine and then hop on a bike for an hour versus go out and just smash the legs and like slog through the ugliest running miles you've ever seen in your life. I would rather see them do the plyos, do some low impact cardio, and then go out for like a shorter run where the quality's better, the pace is better, they're able to hold good technique with their running. I think they're going to get more out of that than just going out and shuffling along and then having sore knees and stuff, and then they can't lift heavy the next day and that sort of thing. Obviously, it's different for everyone, and the more you do it, you're going to build that tolerance. I'm able to run quite a few miles. I could probably run more like 60 to 70 miles per week without really noticing much in terms of soreness and fatigue in the gym. But it's taken me a long time to get there. Most people starting out are going to need to rely pretty heavily on some of those alternate modalities just to get that cardio base up.
Yeah. Okay. So I know this would be very, very dependent on the individual context. And you might not be able to give specifics because it depends on me versus you versus Donnie or anyone else. But let's say I wanted to I'm a lifter, I'm training 3 to 5 days a week in the gym, standard bro stuff, and I want to get to my first 5K as a runner while still maintaining the exact same gym work. What might be a principles-based progression model you would use? Because you've already said there, you wouldn't necessarily take me from doing no running to start running. You introduce some plyometrics first with some low impact, and then you might progress to something else.
Sure. I don't think that anything is off limits. I just think you need to get the dose right. I think a lot of people think you have to have a certain fitness level to be able to do a certain type of training. You hear people say, you should be able to squat X percentage of your body weight before doing plyometrics, or you should have a strong aerobic endurance base before you add sprint training or whatever. And for the most part, I think that's all made up BS. I think regardless of your fitness level, you can do any type of training. You just have to scale appropriately. So even if you've never run before in your life, you can do easy training, you can do medium training, and you can do hard training. So the question then is, based on your fitness level, what does easy, medium, and hard look like for you? So for you, as someone training for their first 5K, for example, easy training might be kind of a shuffle/walk workout where you kind of jog for a minute, walk for a minute, jog for a minute, walk for a minute. That might be your easy training. You could complement that with some easy time on a bike or a rower or something low impact. Medium training for you might mean you just go out and run what feels comfortable. You might be able to run that pace for 4 or 5 minutes at a time, and that might be kind of medium effort. And then you could repeat that a couple times with some break between. Hard training might be trying to run up a hill for 30 seconds to a minute. Doing that a couple of times. Easy, medium, hard looks different for everyone. but everyone can do it. You don't have to wait until you're fit enough to train hard. You don't have to wait until you're fit enough to train a certain way. You just have to figure out what those words mean for you.
Yeah, and like you chose hill sprints for hard. Is that because that's a slightly lower impact way to push yourself with running?
I feel that hill sprints, and I use the word sprint lightly because, whether you're running hard or truly sprinting all out, it looks a little bit differently. The technique changes as you go from just running hard to that all out effort. But I find that uphill is a little bit less impact, a little bit more forgiving, especially for the beginner. So for hard training, I usually start people on a hill. I find that people can get a lot more quality work on the hill. They're less worried about, pulling a hammy or something like that. And they can still get a little bit more out of it in terms of output. I'll often kind of gradually transition people from hill sprints to flat sprints over time to start working on that turnover. But I find as far as hard training goes for the beginner, most people can get really good, high quality, hard training on a hill and still feel pretty good the next day.
Yeah. And do you worry much about technique or mechanics in how somebody would be just like, again, the complete beginner? I know that as you get more advanced, it becomes more and more relevant. But if I was just starting out for the first few months or so, do you put much emphasis on that? Or do you just more so say, let's just focus on the easy, medium, hard and let your body find its own solution?
Running technique is an interesting one because I feel that some elements of it should be coached and some elements of it are sort of just the body self-organizing and kind of figuring out how to solve that movement problem of gait. Most people, when they start running, their technique is not going to be great, obviously. Just like someone in the gym for the first time. You bring in a beginner, throw a barbell in the back, tell them to squat, it's not going to look great. But I often find, and you may have had this experience training people in the gym, if you give someone a weight that's far too light, you bring in a pretty strong, kind of naturally strong guy to the gym for the first time and give him some 5 kilo dumbbells and tell him to do a chest press, his arms might be flailing everywhere, like going everywhere. And you're like, no, that's not how you do it. But if you gave him something a little bit heavier, he would kind of naturally figure out, oh, that's how you have to do it. I just needed some more weight in my hands to feel what it was supposed to feel like. Sometimes it can be hard to learn and exercise a PVC pipe because you don't have that feel of the weight in your hands. The same thing can often be true with running, where when someone's jogging, they might have terrible technique. You tell them sprint up that hill, suddenly things look a little bit better. And so I find that speed work, and that's one of the reasons that I don't think that beginners should wait until they're fit enough to train hard.
Totally.
Speed work is often a very great way to naturally correct someone's technique, because if you want to run fast, you have to run at least somewhat well. There may be still some things that we coach and cue for sure, but often people's technique gets much better when they go from that jog to a run to actually training hard. So it's a great way to work on technique. It's a lazy way to work on technique. Just tell someone just run hard and figure it out. But it does work pretty well to get someone running fast in a variety of contexts, have them run uphill fast, run downhill fast, and just kind of work on improving performance over those distances. And they will naturally figure out kind of naturally more efficient technique. That being said, there are times we want to coach, cue, correct certain things, but a lot of components of gait should be passive or reflexive. I always bring up the example of kind of the robot. If you create like a human skeleton robot, no motors, no power, no anything, just kind of all the joints and stuff that a person has, and push it down the hill, it will start running or walking. If you give it that initial push, a lot of things just happen as a result of momentum. And we don't want to try to interfere with some of those natural, just kind of reflexive, momentum-based components of gait too much. A common example is the kickback. So when you see someone's heel kind of come up towards their butt when they're running, a lot of people will coach and cue that, and they'll say, okay, try to kick your butt. And that makes absolutely no sense.
Right. Okay.
It's not something that you're doing on purpose. No one's out there running, being conscious of trying to kick their butt. It's just the momentum of your leg moving backwards from hip extension. The hamstring is not serving as a knee flexor while you're running. It's serving as a hip extender. So if you try to cue knee flexion in an exercise, in something like gait, where that's not the function of that muscle anyway, it just makes no sense. If you see someone that doesn't have, their heel is not getting high enough or close to their butt, it feels like their legs are staying close to the ground, maybe you want to look at their hip extension, not just tell them to kick their butt. So you want to think about, what am I actually trying to accomplish here? And am I kind of addressing symptoms, or am I looking at what should I actually cue essentially. There's only a couple of things that you really want to try to cue and correct, and the rest of it just kind of happens. So I might cue someone's arm swing or their kind of overall like posture and body lean, their body angle. I may cue some things like that. I may cue someone's overall cadence, tell them to try to pick up their cadence a little bit or slow it down. I may give very general cues of, try to float a little bit more or be a little bit more relaxed. Some people have a very flat run. Like you see them and there's just no vertical bounce. They're just sliding along the ground. I'll tell that person, try to bounce a little bit more. Other people, they're bouncing up and down. I'm like, let's take away some of that bounce. Let's try to be a little bit smoother. If you watch your, the brim of your hat on the horizon, let's try to control that bounce a little bit more. So I'll often use much more general cues. I would never tell someone, try to pronate 5 degrees less with your foot strike. Because when you get someone overthinking something, as complex as gait, everything just falls apart. So I always focus on just a more general look and feel for the most part, and try not to overcoach or overcue. I think it's very important to recognize that no one's running technique is perfect. Even the pros. Some pros have notoriously bad running technique. And depending on how long you've trained, you may be very good at doing something wrong. And that's okay. There's something called learned efficiency. You may be very, very efficient, very, very good at doing something that maybe on paper isn't quite optimal. And do we want to take away that learned efficiency and say, you know what, this thing you've been doing for 15 years, change it. We're going to force you to do this thing that feels very awkward because research says it's 1% more efficient in terms of your running economy. That is sometimes a terrible idea. So sometimes you just have to say, okay, I'm working with a 45-year-old marathon runner who's been running for 20 years. They do this one little weird thing. They've been doing it their whole life. Is that worth trying to fix? So sometimes you have to think about the bigger picture context with it too.
Hey guys, thanks for listening this far into the podcast. If you're not sure where to start with hybrid training, I have some programs available for beginners, intermediates, and advanced athletes for distances ranging from 5K up to a marathon. If you're interested in any of those programs, just click the link below.
Where do you draw the line between technical deficiencies or being straying from the perfect textbook technique and injuries? Like what's really going on when somebody does end up getting injured, or let's say from running specifically, what's usually the culprit?
When we look at running injuries and the data on things like running technique and injury, running footwear and injury, things like that, it's very, very muddy. There is no clear running this way causes injury or this technique causes injury. There's sometimes some loose correlations where it's like, if you have this running technique, you might be just slightly more likely to injure this particular muscle, but maybe less likely to injure this muscle. So it's always like this give and take. It's a trade-off. There's no clear thing where it's like, oh, run this way and you're doomed. I generally find that someone's running technique and lifting technique as well usually tells me much less about if the person is going to get injured and more about just where. So if I watch someone run and you say, do you think this person is going to get hurt? I have no idea. If you say, if this person gets hurt, what do you think it will be? You're like, oh, I could see that person maybe getting some Achilles issues if they pushed it too hard. They're running in a way that they're kind of using that structure, that tissue quite a bit. So can we predict all injuries? Absolutely not. Can we predict some injuries or avoid some injuries by not training like a total goofball? Don't train too hard. Don't exceed your capacity.
Totally.
But otherwise, even people that have the wonkiest technique, and I live in a pretty crowded area of the city. We have a great running path around the lake. My wife and I walk around it a couple times a week, and we always kind of chuckle and laugh. It's fun to people watch and watch the people run around with the worst running technique you have ever seen. Like things that I didn't even know were humanly possible. Like I'll watch someone's foot pronate so much that their ankle like touches the ground. And I'm like, how is that even possible? But you see them out there and they're running the next week and they're running the next week. And you just see some absolutely wild things. And it's a testament to the fact that the human body is so robust, so resilient, so incredible at adapting to the demands you impose on it, that if you progress appropriately, if you work within your limits, technique is important for performance and efficiency. but I wouldn't worry about getting hurt because of some weird thing you do with your gait.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember when I first started my running journey, I posted it on Instagram quite tongue-in-cheek because I knew what the responses would be, because I'm a big heel striker when I run. And I knew people are going to jump on that and be like, oh, you should try running more into the ball of your foot and not heel strike because you're going to smash up your knees or whatever. And I knew that's not the ideal thing in terms of like the recommendations, because I think I've looked into the research and it is quite balanced, saying you're not going to prevent an injury or cause an injury by doing this. And even if you were, and like I think the research does show you that people who are more forefoot strikers, they may get more, maybe it's Achilles or calf versus heels, maybe more knee. But no one's immune to getting destroyed if you're doing too much volume. And it's not the exercise or the technique that was the issue, it was the implementation of you did too much. If you ran 20 Ks, you can only handle 2 Ks, guess what? It wasn't the heel strike, it was your poor programming.
Yeah.
And I find the same thing in the gym is, we see so many variables in how somebody will deadlift or bench press, and they'll get away with it as well. And they won't just get away with it, they'll actually improve over time.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, that's pretty cool, because they've organically or intentionally found a way to stay within the threshold of their recovery. But it's when you exceed it, or when you're under recovered for whatever reason and you go that little bit more than what your body can handle for the day, that's when you start to get injured. But yeah, I do agree, like the body is a very adaptive and resilient thing, which I guess makes me want to ask you a little bit more about like how you train, because you if you look at the way that you train in the gym, it is a little bit less conventional to standard people's training. You're doing all the basic lifts, you're bench pressing, you're deadlifting, you're squatting, but you're also, what I love a lot is to see how you explore so many different positions and ranges of motion, and even some of these more dangerous or vulnerable areas. So I'd love you can just talk a little bit about what goes into your mind when you're picking up exercises in the gym and training.
Yeah, for sure. So, some important concepts to me are movement optimism and just kind of anti-fragility. So kind of rejecting some of the, frankly, made up stuff that you see a lot in the fitness industry. A lot of fitness content and fitness education, even from physical therapists and chiropractors and stuff, unfortunately, is a lot of made up stuff about what's dangerous, things you shouldn't do. You only have to scroll on Instagram for 2 minutes to find like a stop doing this exercise sort of video.
Yes.
There's some like graphic of like your spine exploding, like a nuclear bomb going off in your L4, L5 area. Drives me absolutely nuts. Because the last thing we need is more people being afraid of movement. The last thing we need is more people being afraid of lifting heavy in the gym. We need more people lifting heavy in the gym. We need more people training hard. It's the very best thing that most people can do. And like we were talking about with running, it's all about training within your tolerance, your capacity. And when it comes to a lot of movements that people are traditionally afraid of, like rounding your back in a Jefferson curl or something like that, a lot of people's capacity is quite low. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, no, you can't just bring someone in the gym and have them 1RM a Jefferson curl. Like, no one would say that's a good idea. But I think embracing the adaptability of the human body and saying, no, you may not do that today, but you might 6 months from now, a year from now, it's something we can work towards. So if there's a vulnerability, if there's a weakness, if there's something you're afraid of, there's an opportunity. And so a lot of people are afraid of rounding their back or side bends. That blew my mind. I didn't even know for the longest time that people thought side bends were dangerous.
Yeah.
I've been doing side bends for a long time. They're just fun, great oblique exercise. And then I start seeing this content. It's like, stop doing side bends. I'm like, are you kidding me? Stop doing side bends? And so I kind of went with that. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to go like all in on the side bends. And I start, kind of talking about side bends more and launch a side bend challenge of like, let's all test our 1RM side bends, and just all the people that are afraid of side bends are going to lose their minds over this.
Yeah.
So I challenged people on the internet, send me your 1 rep max barbell side bend. And we had people doing side bends with like 140 kilos.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
As far as I know, no one's back exploded. Maybe it did, and they just didn't share those videos.
It's survivorship bias. You just haven't heard it because they've actually
There's
now
people
died.
in the hospital.
Yeah.
But we had so many very, very impressive. I did actually. I'll be honest. Some people are like, "Yeah, I shouldn't have gone that heavy." It's like, well, fair. But it just goes to show that like you can do some absolutely wild things with lifts that people are traditionally afraid of. You just have to not train like a total moron.
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
you got to progressively load. You got to work within your limits. So my training, you know, I like the traditional lifts. I like my big three. I like some classic, you know, hypertrophy work on some machines. But I really like embracing some of these things that a lot of people are afraid of. And you get some weird looks in the gym. You get some unsolicited advice of, hey, you're not supposed to, you know, that's not how you do a deadlift. I'm like, I'm not doing a deadlift.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah.
So I like doing some of that stuff just because it challenges people's kind of biases and kind of ingrained beliefs, which are often really limiting and I think hold people back. So I intentionally kind of push myself extra hard, not because I think it's going to make me some superior athlete or have any like insane benefits. I just want to show people that like these are not things to fear. You know, you can do some crazy stuff that, you know, you look at the YouTube comments and people are like, you're going to tear your ACL doing that. I love it. Like the more comments like that I get, the more I know like I'm on the right path.
Totally. Yeah, I think people really do shortchange just how adaptable and how much your body can withstand forces from the gym or training in general, and they'll get better for it. I think every single tissue in the body can, like in terms of like our contractile muscle tendons, it can all regenerate and heal at different rates and different paces. But like what you said at the start is like everybody should be training heavy. People freak out and it's like, well, heavy is a relative term.
Yeah.
Like heavy on a round back deadlift or a Jefferson curl, the heavy might only be 10 pounds for you, but you should be pushing that as hard as you can or within your heavy limits. And I guess just like you said at the very start, where you're saying like you didn't set out with a goal of a 405 split squat. It just sort of happened over several years of you saying, okay, 225 is easy now. Let's go 230. Let's go 245 and just keep slowly progressing. Because the body is so resilient. Like I've always liked the idea of going to all these weak areas. I say if something is really weak on me, that is an opportunity to say, what if I got it super, super strong? What would that potentially unlock? What would that then mean for everyday life? Because as much as we like to say like gym training in the traditional sense is really good for you, and it is good for you, it does have flaws. You know, there are gaps in the areas that most traditional exercises take you into, and then everyday life will take you into those positions, like it or not. Like if I want to pick up my dog off the ground or my child off the ground, it's going to be with a round back. It's going to be with my knees over my toes. It's going to be with my heels off the ground. It's going to be in a weird staggered stance. And yeah, it's not a 1 rep max when I pick my daughter off the ground, but it is lifting awkwardly. And I've always said to myself, if I never train that in the gym, where I'm very safe and can be controlled, what happens when I'm doing the exact same movement and position out of the gym in a more uncontrolled setting? Of course I'm going to snap something. It makes sense that I would snap something. Yeah. So I might as well do something in here to try to address that. And I found just one thing, I just feel a lot better strength-wise, but I can move so much better. Like I'm not doing a lot of active flexibility work or mobility work when my body just has that kinesthetic strength and awareness just from doing these weird things, I guess. And I'm sure you're very much the same.
Yeah. And I think it's, it's interesting how, you know, whether it's, you know, your genetics or anthropometry or your just athletic background, kind of what things come more naturally or less naturally. But for me, like when I've pushed some of the kind of crazy knee stuff, like sissy squats and reverse Nordics and that kind of stuff, I never had a single issue. Like my knees have never hurt. I've been able to progress those things very quickly. And I don't know why. Is it I have genetically good knees or is it my running background or what it is? But I've never had any issues with that. But the round back stuff, Jefferson curls and you know, those sorts of things has always been very challenging for me. It's not something I've progressed quickly. I've often, you know, made a couple steps forward and then had to take a step back. You know, I'll go a little bit too hard on what I think doesn't feel that bad. I'm like, oh shoot, that maybe was a little bit too heavy. And I've heard people have different experiences with all sorts of lifts. You know, I've heard people try sissy squats and they blow out their knee and they're like, oh, I overdid it. And, you know, it's a natural part of the process. Don't get down on yourself or discouraged or think you did anything wrong if those setbacks happen or if you do take a step back. Because if you're training hard, you know, I don't want anyone to get hurt. But you might take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and kind of repeat that process. and some things are going to come a little bit more naturally for you than others. But don't let that stop you. Just realize that you're not going to progress at the same rate as everybody else. That's fine. There's so many guys that I look up to that I've gotten a lot of inspiration from with some of the round back stuff. And I may never be as strong as they are at the Jefferson curl. And that's A-okay. So don't feel like there's something wrong with you. If you're someone who can't Jefferson curl or if you're just starting, you're doing 10 pounds, there's nothing wrong with you. You don't have to be able to do all these crazy feats. That's not what, movement optimism or anti-fragility is about. It's about recognizing that you can improve. It's not about being super good at something. It's not about having freak athletic abilities or insane mobility. It's just recognizing the fact that if there's something you can't do, you can at least work towards it.
And I guess that's where it becomes really important to look at progression and regression, not just as a weight thing. Like, oh, you can't do a 10-pound Jefferson curl, you should do a 9 pounds, or if you can, you should do a 15-pound. It may be more about, you can't do a Jefferson curl of 10 pounds, maybe we need to change the exercise up a little bit. Yeah. Maybe the range, maybe the way that you position your body instead, just to make it more accessible. Where I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that. When it comes to gym specifically, they think, oh, lift the weight.
Yeah.
And if I can't do that, it's bad for me, write it off. Instead of saying, well, maybe can I reduce the range, pace, body position in some way to make it easier? That's what you do a lot with your training, isn't it? You think about that spectrum.
Yeah. I like to think about the bulk of my training, 80% of my training is how can I train as hard as possible? Essentially, so what movements can I pick that allow me to train really, really hard? So if there's a movement that I can only use 2 pounds on, not that I wouldn't do that movement, but it's not going to make up the bulk of my training. I'm not going to go to the gym and pick 12 exercises that I absolutely suck at all of them, never pick up anything heavier than a 5-pound dumbbell, and spend my time in the gym that way. I'm probably not going to have enough overall kind of systemic stress to make a lot of progress. So the majority of my training is picking exercises that allow me to train as hard as I can. The remaining 10 to 20% of my training is a little bit more exploratory of, okay, what are some weak points? Where are some opportunities where I can train easy, kind of easy to medium, and still kind of be on a path forward? So you might be someone who can push really hard on deadlifts, but you might just not have very good tolerance for round back work. So you might be doing a very light Jefferson curl. You might even be doing like a kind of resisted cat-cow, with like a band or a belt around your back. That could be a great place to start. Are you going to get jacked out of your mind doing that exercise? No. So I'm not going to have you spend 60 minutes in the gym on it. You might spend 55 of your 60-minute workout, pushing hard on your deadlifts and your leg curls and whatever. And then just 5 minutes, you're going to start exploring some of those ranges that are a little bit uncomfortable or scary to you in a way that feels very safe. I never want people to feel threatened. I don't want people to feel like they're at risk of an injury. I want to find those positions that feel a little bit vulnerable, those movements that might otherwise be a little bit scary, and figure out how can we make it not scary. So, rounding your back on a deadlift is scary. Is rounding your back on a Jefferson curl scary? Maybe. Okay, is rounding your back on a cat camel scary? No. Okay, you feel good there. Okay, let's start there and load it up a little bit. So I always want people to feel comfortable. I want people to feel safe. I never want someone to freak out and be having this like internal conflict during a movement. That kinesiophobia, that fear of movement, not what we're after. That's not the point. We want to gradually overcome that, maybe expose them to little bits and pieces of it. But to me, it's all about how can we take the scary and make it not scary and then progress it. And then all of a sudden they're doing something that used to be scary, but it's not anymore because we got them there gradually.
Hey guys, if you're interested in learning more about some of these exploratory movements and challenging your body in positions that might make you a little bit uncomfortable, be sure to check out the programs below and see what you think.
Yeah, totally. I mean, as a principle, it's just this gradal exposure. Same as like the way you'd get over an actual phobia of just gradually expose yourself to a slightly more aggressive stimulus. And then all of a sudden you just have this awareness and confidence to deal with that. What was once stressful and scary is now nothing. It's just easy work. I just love how you keep coming back to like this easy, medium, hard. You saw it up with cardio training, conditioning work, and running, and now it's like, oh, actually that makes sense with training as well as gym training. We always think about it should be hard all the time, but there is a really useful piece about putting in some specifically easy work because you suck at it right now.
Yeah.
And then the goal is to make the easy work hard. And then how much easy work can you squish in without it taking away from your hard training? And then how can you push that easy training eventually into medium and then eventually into hard, and then introduce some more easy work, because there's an endless amount of positions that we can always work on exploring. How much do you train? Like how many sessions or hours do you train in with everything?
Yeah. So I train, I do 5 to 6 days a week of strength training. Sometimes I'll consolidate it into fewer but longer sessions.
Yeah.
So I'm doing, lower body twice a week, upper body twice a week, usually divided into push and pull. So usually 5 or 6 sessions. And then I'd say I average an hour a day of cardio training of some kind, usually a little bit longer on the weekends.
Yeah.
Some of that's running, some of that is lower impact stuff. And then I tend to be pretty active outside of my structured training. Bike commuting and walking around the city and those sorts of things. So whether you count that as low intensity training or not.
Well, it's all activity.
Yeah.
How do you recover from all that? Because it's I might go to the gym on a really hard week, maybe 6 or 7 sessions, and I struggle to recover from that. And then I add in a few, maybe 2 or 3 cardio sessions, and I'm pretty wiped. But like, what do you do?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I think are really critical or important for my recovery. One is just the aerobic capacity. Like one of the biggest determinants of your recovery, your creatine phosphate replenishment, even between sets and between workouts, is just your VO2 max. How aerobically fit are you? The more aerobically fit you are, that's just going to make everything easier. It's going to make your life easier across the board. 2, especially for the hybrid athlete who's doing a lot of training, I try to keep variety on the lower side. Now, I say that and it may sound confusing because I tend to train a wide variety of movements, but I try not to mix it up too much from one week to the next. I try not to just have 10 new movements in a workout, or I'm going to be super sore, and that's just going to make the recovery a lot more challenging. So I might have a bunch of kind of cool creative movements in a workout, but when I get to that session the next week, I'll change at most one small thing about that session. So I'm never making super, super big drastic changes to my program because it's just not worth it from a recovery perspective.
Yeah.
And then 3 is just kind of lifestyle factors and luck, kind of good fortune to have the time, the energy, the resources, the money to spend on good food, all those sorts of things. And it definitely makes a big difference in terms of being able to sleep enough. I don't have kids. I can't imagine trying to train as much as I do with those sorts of responsibilities. So I think it's worth pointing out that I have a lot of advantages for recovery that a lot of people probably don't.
I love that. I mean, it's the first 2 most important things. It's not a sauna, or it's not cold therapy, or it's not a certain Tonkat Ali supplement. It's how aerobically fit you are, which come down to a lot of the volume of easy training of your, say, runs or low impact cardio, and how you go about actually structuring your programming, where you have progression in mind, but you have a lot less novelty than people may see when they look on maybe an Instagram feed or something. It's 80% basic, exactly the same thing each week, so your body can build that tolerance over time, and a little bit of exploratory variation. But I think a lot of people, when it comes to recovery, they focus a lot on the cool, sexy marketing hype. And I think I've always thought the most important variables for recovery are your training. Instead of trying to fill that ditch with more and more dirt or whatever, stop digging as deep a ditch. Or think about ways to be just smarter about your digging, in this random hole analogy. And I think that's really, really important. It's really, really great that you've sort of mentioned that. When it comes to diet, you've got a pretty interesting take. I don't want to call it interesting take. But I guess people wouldn't necessarily expect you to be as high performing as you are as a plant-based or a vegan athlete. Now I know, I'm not going to turn this into a whole what I eat in a day kind of thing, but I am curious to hear a little bit about how you structure your diet, because I think that's quite interesting for a lot of people to hear that, you're plant-based. Is it full vegan from ethical reasons?
Yeah, full vegan. I shouldn't say that because I will have honey, which I know that, talk to a lot of vegans, they don't do honey. I don't mind that so much, but I haven't had in besides that, I haven't had an animal product in about 15 years.
Wow.
It's not something I talk about a lot for a couple of reasons. One, I find it can be a big turn off for a lot of people.
Totally.
You know, you mentioned, I'm vegan. They're like, here he goes on his.
That's why I put this at the end of the discussion.
Yeah, and they're like, I'm tuning out now. I don't need to hear this. I don't want to feel uncomfortable or anything. So I don't talk about it quite a bit for that reason. But also, it's so normal to me. It's not something I think about.
Totally.
I don't wake up and think, I'm
vegan today.
I'm vegan today. This is a day in the life of a vegan hybrid athlete. Like it's just how I eat. It's just kind of my worldview and how I go about my life. So it's kind of uninteresting to me. And then people will talk about it and they're interested. It's fascinating to them because it's new to them. And I'm like, I don't know. I just can eat food, you know? And they're like, what do you mean? Like, what do you eat? I'm like, I don't know, food. But for real though, like a typical day for me is, I have some veggies, some rice, some beans, some tofu, just a wide variety of foods that's not meat and dairy. I'm not super conscientious, if you will, of my macros overall. I'm not super picky or stringent. I just keep mental tabs on my protein. I try to make sure I get about 1 gram per pound of body weight. But I'm not like writing it down in a notebook. I'll just kind of, at the end of the day, be like, did I get enough protein today? And if I'm like a little bit hungry or I'm like, I didn't really have much protein for lunch, I might have a shake before bed or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's about as complicated as I make it. You can certainly make it more complicated. There's people that love to debate intuitive eating and is it practical or should you track? And I think there's no right answer. For some people, tracking your macros and counting your protein can be a very useful, instructive tool. Some people might need to do it longer. Some people might need to do it in more or less detail. For me, I find without really thinking about it, I tend to do okay though.
Yeah, totally. I spent about 10 years ago now, probably. I spent about 6 months eating completely plant-based. I don't want to call it vegan, even though technically it was, because I did it more as an experiment because I had a lot of clients at the time who were plant-based, and I was like, for their various ethical and religious reasons, and I was like, I know, I guess, physiologically what you're dealing with, but I really want to experience it for myself. So I ran a 6-month little experiment for myself to see just what it would be like, and it was challenging as someone who was just like starting out with it. I was thinking a lot about how do I make sure I'm getting not just enough protein, but the right amino acids. Am I getting enough leucine? Am I getting enough tryptophan? Am I getting enough of the right ratio of amino acids to support muscle building and recovery, to get these complete proteins? Should we be thinking about matching up like brown rice with certain legumes, with soy and everything like that to make sure I'm doing that? And then there was a whole fear 15 years ago around soy giving you man boobs and xenoestrogens and phthalates, or that's more plastics. It was a very tricky thing to navigate, but it was doable. Like actually, I do remember one time eventually I just made it so simple for myself. I discovered hemp seeds. Hemp being something that's very complete protein, good amino acid profile, very dense in protein. And I would just have so much of that. And I went to a wedding and I'd RSVP'd to this wedding before I started this vegan thing. And so I ticked the box saying, serve me a steak. And I didn't need to have any dietary requirements. And then got to the wedding. I was like, I've got this steak here. I'm not going to eat it. It's just out of the pure principle of what I'm doing. So I had my little Tupperware of just pure hemp seeds. Yeah. And I was just eating that. I went outside. I didn't eat at the table. Yeah. Just ate this Tupperware of hemp seeds. But yeah, do you think about things like that, like trying to hit a complete protein or matching up different sources, or is it second nature?
I think a lot of the things that people think about are not as important as they think they are in the grand scheme of things. So in terms of getting a complete protein and getting all of your amino acids, obviously super important. You don't want to be missing out on leucine and those sorts of things. But that doesn't mean that you have to get a perfect protein and the perfect amount of protein every single time you eat something.
Right. Okay.
And even if you're not a vegan, if you're just a regular person, you don't have to have protein at every meal. You can have an apple for a snack, and it's not a complete protein. You're not meeting the leucine threshold in the apple that you ate. Yeah. And the same thing applies as a vegan. You might have a meal that is a little bit low in a particular amino acid. As long as over every 24 to 48 hour period, you're getting sufficient protein, sufficient amino acids. You don't have to combine them to be a perfect, complete protein at every meal or every time you eat. And a lot of the concepts surrounding like the leucine threshold and those sorts of things for like spiking muscle protein synthesis anyway, the research is a little bit muddier, I think, than a lot of people think. And that for the most part, those studies on like the leucine threshold, it's based on someone that has not resistance trained. You're just kind of in the fasted state. Let's give you some protein and see what happens. Those thresholds shift a little bit if you've just done a resistance training session. So maybe you don't need quite as much leucine post-workout to spike muscle protein synthesis as you do if you're just in a fasted state. And then let's measure some of these numbers. Changes by age too. So there tends to be a higher, more obvious leucine threshold for older adults than for like a young person. So maybe if you're on the older side, if you're in your 60s or 70s, you might want to pay a little bit more attention to, am I getting a little bit more protein or leucine-rich protein sources? If you're in your 20s and you're working out and you get enough protein throughout the day, you're probably going to be okay. I think if you are plant-based and you're not getting perfect proteins, some of your proteins are maybe a little bit lower quality than some of the animal-based proteins, you can just kind of give yourself a little bit of an insurance policy, eat an extra 20, 30 grams of protein. And it's honestly as simple as that. If your protein sources aren't perfect, just have a little bit more, and that is totally fine. So, whereas I usually target, about a gram per pound of lean body mass, I just do a full gram per pound of total body mass, and I'm definitely gonna get enough of all the amino acids I need, as long as I'm not doing anything super weird, as long as I'm not getting all of my protein from, mock chicken from wheat gluten or something like that. If I'm eating a range of protein sources, it's going to be just fine.
Yeah, I think, do you add in any extra? I know you take some plant-based protein sometimes as a supplement. Would you ever think about supplementing specifically with maybe a leucine, or do you think about, even in the back of your mind subconsciously, are you aware of, maybe if I just had a lot of, I don't know, lentils that may be lower in this certain amino acid, so I've got to make sure I've got this to hit my leucine or my tryptophan. Is that kind of in your awareness?
Leucine is the big one. And most protein powders, so like pea protein powder is a fantastic source of leucine. So if you are a plant-based athlete and you're using a plant-based protein of any kind and you're hitting your protein targets, there's really nothing to worry about. If you aren't using a protein powder, getting some like lentils and some sort of legume would be a good idea. But for the most part, pea protein is high enough in leucine that if you got a scoop or two of that in your diet, those leucine numbers are not something you need to worry about too much.
I think, a lot of this may sound foreign and off-putting to people, or overly complicated as well, but even in a traditional omnivorous diet, I'm not going to tell someone to just eat chicken all the time. Like I want people to have, even just looking at pure muscle meats versus organ meats, I don't want people just having pure muscle meats, because yes, you're getting a complete amino profile, but are you getting enough of certain aminos, like something like glycine or something like even like choline, or are you getting enough of the general other nutrients like your zinc, magnesiums, and copper? Like if you just eat muscle meats, it's going to be very hard to get enough copper in the diet. You add in a tiny little bit of beef liver or a tiny little bit of even certain seafoods and shellfish, you're going to really boost up your copper intake, which, again, I've come across so many omnivorous bodybuilders or strength athletes and see there's some pretty hefty deficiencies and pretty hefty things that they're noticing in their context of like how they feel each day. It's like, well, I'm not a doctor, I can't diagnose this, but if you're getting some of these issues and your diet's also very low in copper or very low in zinc and very low in magnesium, eat all the chicken you want, eat all the omnivorous diets you want, it's not working for you right now. And it can be just as complicated. I guess it's just a lot of societal stigma against the whole veganism or plant-based, which just seemed a little bit quirky and weird and too complicated, but it's just like any other diet, really.
No one is immune to deficiencies, and sort of like we talked about with injury, like I can't predict injury, but I might be able to guess what thing might get hurt based on how you're moving. If you're doing the Jefferson curl, you're probably not going to injure your shoulder. It's probably going to be your back. If you do get hurt. And same thing with the diet. If you tell me I'm vegan or I'm carnivore or I'm omnivorous, I don't know if you have a deficiency, but I might be able to guess what some of them might be. So if you are vegan, some of the more common ones that I would think about would be like zinc, for example, is one that a lot of vegans don't get enough of. But plenty of omnivorous people don't get enough, like vitamin A, for example.
Absolutely.
So no one is immune. Everyone has to think about some of these things. Sure, you may be making things just a pinch more complicated for yourself by restricting a food group, like animal products. But it's not that different. Everyone has to think about these things, and everyone has to think about what it means to eat a good diet that's going to support a high intensity training program.
Yeah. What would you do for zinc? Would you supplement, or would you look at, are there certain foods that are very high in zinc in the plant-based world?
As far as extremely high in zinc, no. I think if you're eating primarily whole foods, getting a lot of legumes and grains, you're going to get some. But it is one of the biggest things I'd look for in a supplement. So if you are taking a multivitamin or something like that as a plant-based athlete, I would make sure that it has a good amount of zinc and copper. You don't want to take too much zinc. It can kind of compete for absorption with copper. So I'd make sure you have both. But it is admittedly one of the trickier ones. And I think it's important to not just turn a blind eye to like, oh, it's all fine. Like there's nothing to worry about. There's gaps. Everyone has potential gaps they need to watch out for. So to say, yeah, maybe you should take a protein powder, or maybe you should supplement with this is fine. It's better to be aware of some of those gaps and address them than to just pretend they don't exist.
Yeah. I think a huge mistake that I see a lot of people make with any diet is they're like, oh, I'm going to go plant-based now. So that just means what I'm currently doing with no meat. And it's like, well, that's a great way to really mess yourself up. Like it should be, you remove the meat for whatever reason you want, but then what do you need to add in?
Yeah.
And like I know for myself personally, when I was following plant-based diet, I had no issues with hitting enough magnesium and replenishing my magnesium, like through red blood cell magnesium tests. I could see, oh, this is actually awesome for my magnesium levels. And I've taken a lot of that knowledge, and I still do it now. Like I have a lot of like sprouted lentils and grains and chickpeas in my diet to just boost up my magnesium to the point where I don't really take a supplement for it anymore. And also fiber was a huge one. Like a lot of lentils, a lot of legumes, you're going to get a lot of fiber in there. But I think like even like calcium, most people on an omnivorous diet, they're not getting enough calcium in. Like, do you think about calcium or iron much at all as nutrients?
I think about all of them a little bit,
sure.
right? I eat a lot of chocolate. Like that's got to be, and not for any nutritious reasons. I just love chocolate.
Fair enough.
So I actually get a decent amount of iron through chocolate.
I never would have thought that as an iron thing.
Yeah, a little bit.
Really?
Especially like raw cacao powder.
Yeah, raw cacao.
Throw that in a shake and that sort of thing.
Interesting.
That along with, legumes are a big one for a lot of those kind of minerals that people often worry about. But yeah, I don't necessarily think about any particular one a lot more than another.
For sure.
It for the most part comes back to eat as varied of a diet as you can.
Yes.
It's a good idea for everyone.
Absolutely.
But especially if you're already taking out this big chunk.
Yeah.
Don't limit yourself even more than you have to. So try to eat, grains, legumes, etc. I often talk to vegans that are like, okay, I want to be vegan, but I don't like beans. I don't like tofu. I don't like mushrooms. And they list out, I'm like, you just listed the rest of the, like you just eliminated everything.
You're going to be a breatharian.
Like you obviously eat within your dietary preferences, and there's going to be things you don't love. But if you're already taking out this big chunk of food groups, like you have to be willing to branch out and eat a pretty wide variety.
Absolutely. Do you think much about, like, actually, no, not do you think about much about, but what are your thoughts on a lot of the information that's being put out about phytates, phytic acid, and these anti-nutrients? That's something to be concerned about.
Yeah, honestly, it drives me nuts. Like some of the, and it's not that there's nothing wrong. Like anything in the wrong dose is going to be problematic. You can drink too much water. You can have too much phytic acid. You can have too many oxalates. You name it. You can overdo it on anything. And especially if you have certain genetic predispositions, you might be significantly more likely to develop, certain kidney stones if you have too much oxalates or whatever. So there's legitimate concerns for certain subpopulations where you might tell this person, okay, you really need to watch your oxalates or whatever, or your phytic acid, and that's fine. But the majority of people consuming this sort of information on the internet, they're probably not the healthiest people already.
Yeah.
The majority of people are not, kind of top tier health and fitness consumers.
Yeah.
And what it does is it makes kind of lower education and lower income consumers especially less likely to purchase healthy foods. Mm-hmm. That's the end result. You can argue about the details all day of how much phytic acid is too much phytic acid and whatever, but the reality is the majority of people that hear this stuff on a podcast, they're like, oh, oatmeal's bad, I'm not buying that anymore.
Yeah.
And what are they picking instead? Probably something quite a bit worse. So the result, I don't care about the details so much as what is this actually doing on a population level, and it's not good. Getting people to be afraid of oatmeal and beans and literally everything. Like there's nothing is safe now.
Yeah.
There are no health foods anymore. Everything is bad for you. It's making people make less healthy decisions overall, and that's what I care about. So yeah, I think that we should still be discussing, some of these things like phytic acid and anti-nutrients and stuff on a kind of scientific level, and then distilling that down into guidelines for consumers. But I don't think we should be telling consumers phytic acid is bad, because how many people out there are actually eating too much oatmeal or suffering health consequences because of oatmeal? I don't see it. There's somebody out there, I'm sure. There's always somebody.
Always. You hear about the outliers.
You hear about the outliers.
You hear about the extremes and the dangers of phytic acid or these anti-nutrients and oxalates, but you never hear about all the benefits to these foods. And you never hear about the fact that for the vast majority of people, these potential consequences of anti-nutrients are completely unfounded.
Right.
And it's not an issue. And it's not the concern about it. Of course, it does come down to individually, how do you feel when you have them? And if you find personally the beans or legumes just destroy your guts and cause you to shit blood, then you probably shouldn't have them.
Yeah.
I'll say the same thing about red meat or whatever to anybody. It's not about the food itself, and it's not going to happen to every single person, but everybody's got to explore and find their own thing, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's foods like that for me, like sunflower seeds and corn. There's like certain things like, it just doesn't sit well with my stomach. I can tell that it's not something I should probably be eating.
Yeah.
So I think encouraging people to have some self-awareness and experiment with how do you feel when you do or don't eat this food, or varying degrees of it. But I think we should encourage more of that versus, don't eat this, don't eat that. Because then there's nothing left. And I've talked to quite a few people who, they're not health and fitness buffs. They're just kind of average everyday people. And, we'll be talking about, their diet or something, and they'll be like, oh, I thought that was bad for you, in reference to coffee or tea or oatmeal or anything. And I'm like, no, you really should be eating some more of this instead of, your microwave dinners or whatever you're currently having.
Yeah.
Just pick up some produce or some meat at the butcher shop or whatever. I don't really care. Just stop listening to all the fear mongering. And I think, people will straw man it on the other side, and they'll be like, well, didn't you see this study, or aren't you aware of like what happens if you have too much of this? I'm like, yes, I'm aware. It's just not a real problem for real people.
Right.
It might be a problem for this one person, or this outlier with this genetic predisposition, or this weirdo that ate nothing but oatmeal for 6 months or something. The oatmeal diet. Maybe a problem for them, not for real people. And that's who I care about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alec, thank you so much for your time today and sharing with us so much stuff about your training, your nutrition, and everything like that. I really appreciate it. So
Thanks for having me on, Eugene. It was a lot of fun. Hopefully I can come back in the future.
Hope so. Thank you.